It was the kind of late summer morning where the lake seemed to invite people in. September 14th, 2013, began with still water, a thin mist clinging to the tree line, and the muted sound of boat motors echoing across the basin. At the small, weathered marina on Lake Harrison, a few regulars were preparing for their weekend outings when David Rowe pulled in. He was 46, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn jeans and a faded ball cap. His 14-year-old son, Connor, followed close behind, carrying a stack of fishing rods with a quiet focus. They moved with the easy rhythm of two people who had done this many times before. Witnesses would later say nothing seemed unusual that morning. David loaded a cooler from the back of his truck into the boat, a modest white and blue cabin cruiser he'd owned for years. Connor brought along a canvas bag stuffed with snacks and a small tent, the kind they used if they decided to camp on one of the lake's islands overnight. They worked side by side, exchanging only a few words, their familiarity making conversation unnecessary. The weather forecast was promising: clear skies, temperatures in the mid-70s, and only a light breeze in the afternoon. For many in town, it was the last perfect weekend before the chill of autumn set in. Other boaters remembered seeing David at the dock office, signing the logbook, mentioning to the harbor master they'd be back the next morning unless the fish were biting. Connor lingered by the bait freezer, comparing lure colors, and paid for a pack of red worms with change he dug out of his pocket. At 9:12 a.m., the Rose untied from the dock. Several people waved as the cruiser drifted slowly into the channel, its small outboard rumbling to life. David stood at the wheel, and Connor sat near the bow, looking out over the expanse of water. That was the last confirmed sighting of either of them alive. By late afternoon, the sun was warm, and the lake was dotted with other boats. A few fishing crews later told investigators they thought they might have seen the Rose in the western shallows, but no one could be certain. Lake Harrison covers more than 14,000 acres, its shoreline jagged with coves, inlets, and small wooded islands that can make a boat disappear from sight within minutes. When the Rose failed to return by nightfall, no alarm was raised immediately. Friends and neighbors knew David sometimes stayed out longer than planned, especially if the fishing was good. But by the following morning, when their assigned slip remained empty, concern began to set in. At 8:47 a.m., a fisherman radioed in an unusual sighting: a white and blue cabin cruiser drifting near the north shore, its motor running at low idle, no one visible on deck. Coast Guard units and local deputies responded. The boat was in neutral, gently rocking with the small waves. Inside, they found signs of activity but no chaos: 2 folding chairs set up on the deck, a half-empty thermos of coffee, and fishing tackle spread across the bench seats. In the small cabin, the cooler still held food, mostly untouched. Connor's tent was rolled up in its bag, leaning against the wall. But there was no sign of David or Connor. The condition of the boat raised questions immediately. If they'd fallen overboard, why was the engine still running? If they'd stopped somewhere, why leave without securing the vessel? The life jackets were neatly stowed in their compartment. There were no obvious signs of damage, no blood, no overturned equipment. The depth finder was on, showing a steady reading of 42 feet beneath the hull. Deputies searched the immediate area with binoculars while the Coast Guard began a grid sweep. The shoreline was combed for footprints or signs of someone having come ashore recently, but the mud and sand were undisturbed. Neighbors on the North Shore reported no unusual noise or activity overnight. By early afternoon, the search expanded. Helicopters traced the drift path the boat might have taken, factoring in current and wind, while divers were deployed to check the lake bed near where the cruiser was found. The water was murky, visibility less than 5 feet, and the submerged terrain was a mix of silt, rocks, and fallen timber. After hours underwater, divers surfaced empty-handed. As the sun dipped lower, the Rose friends and family began to gather at the marina. Some clung to the hope that David and Connor had simply taken shelter somewhere along the shore, maybe stranded without radio contact. But with each passing hour, the silence weighed heavier. That night, searchlights swept across the lake, and rescue boats moved slowly in wide arcs. Investigators began interviewing anyone who had been on the water the previous day. Most had seen nothing unusual. A few remembered a boat's running lights moving slowly after dark toward the western coves, but no one could confirm it was the Rose. By the end of the first 24 hours, the official tone shifted. What began as a routine search for two overdue fishermen was now a missing persons case. And the one thing investigators knew for certain was this: David and Connor had left the marina together, and less than a day later, their boat had returned without them. The question of how and why would only grow more complicated in the days ahead. The search began before the sun was fully up, the lake still wearing its morning fog like a thin veil. Within hours of the abandoned boat being towed in, the Coast Guard had mobilized 2 patrol boats, a helicopter, and a dive team. Local deputies joined in, bringing smaller craft to maneuver through the narrow coves where larger vessels couldn't go. The plan was straightforward: retrace the boat's likely drift path, sweep the shorelines, and search the depths around where it was first found. By mid-morning, the helicopter was circling low, its crew scanning for movement in the water or along the banks. From the air, Lake Harrison stretched endlessly in all directions, a patchwork of open water, wooded islands, and rocky inlets. Any one of those inlets could conceal someone who had swum or drifted to shore. The hope was still that David and Connor might be stranded somewhere, unable to signal for help. In the first few hours, there were small bursts of optimism. A bright object was spotted near the mouth of Miller Cove, prompting a scramble of boats to the location. It turned out to be a weathered buoy that had broken from its mooring, its faded paint catching the morning light. Later, a volunteer searcher found a black baseball cap floating against the reeds in a narrow channel. It was identified as David's, a familiar sight to friends and family, but it offered no clue about where he might be. The divers worked slowly, methodically, dropping into the cold, dark water near the boat's discovery point. Visibility was almost non-existent, and the silty bottom made every movement a cloudy blur. Using searchlines, they moved in expanding circles, feeling along the lake bed for anything that might explain the disappearance. After hours underwater, they surfaced with nothing more than a broken fishing net and a rusted anchor discarded years earlier. By the second day, search efforts widened. Patrol boats began hugging the shoreline for miles in each direction, scanning for footprints or disturbances in the sand and mud. On a small, uninhabited island less than a mile from the drift path, searchers found an open tackle box on the rocks. Inside were several lures, hooks, and a spool of fishing line. Investigators couldn't determine if it had belonged to the Rose or had been left there by someone else, but its position, far from any maintained dock, made it worth collecting. As the search entered its third day, weather conditions shifted. A stiff wind rolled across the lake, and small waves slapped against the boats. It wasn't a dangerous storm, but it was enough to remind everyone of how quickly conditions could change. Some began to wonder aloud if a sudden squall could have knocked one or both of the Rose into the water. Maybe David had gone in first, Connor trying to save him. The theory had a certain tragic logic, except for the details. There had been no storm warnings, no radio calls for help, and no signs of struggle or damage on the boat. And the life jackets were still neatly stowed, untouched. The absence of bodies complicated everything. In most accidental drownings on the lake, recovery happened within days. Even if currents or debris delayed it, something, a shoe, a jacket, a piece of gear, usually turned up. Here, aside from the cap and the tackle box, there was nothing. Each day that passed made an accident seem less likely and left room for darker possibilities. Foul play began to slip into the conversation, quietly at first, then more openly. Investigators looked into whether the Rose could have met with someone out on the water. The reports of a boat's running lights moving toward the western coves after dark took on new weight. If someone else had been involved, the water would have been the perfect place to leave no witnesses. Local rumor filled the gaps in evidence. Some said David had been in debt, that maybe the trip was a cover for something else entirely. Others suggested a random encounter, another boater, maybe drunk or aggressive, who forced them overboard. Without concrete leads, the theories were endless. By the end of the first week, the search was scaled back. The helicopters were grounded, the dive teams released. A few patrol boats still made passes each morning, and volunteers continued to check the shorelines, but the coordinated push was over. The official stance was that David and Connor were missing, presumed drowned. Unofficially, more and more people believed something else had happened, something deliberate. For the Rowe family, the shift in tone was devastating. They had begun the week hoping to hear that father and son had been found wet, cold, and alive on some remote shore. Now, the absence of evidence felt like evidence in itself, proof that whatever had happened on the lake that day was far more complicated than an accident. And somewhere out there, someone might know exactly why the Rose boat had come back without them. In the absence of physical evidence, investigators turned their focus to the one thing they could still examine: David Rowe's life before the disappearance. On paper, David was an ordinary man. He worked maintenance for the county school district, a steady job he'd held for more than a decade. He had a modest home on the outskirts of town and a son he doted on. But as detectives dug deeper, a more complicated picture began to take shape. Public records showed David had finalized a divorce just 8 months earlier. Friends described it as amicable on the surface, but said there had been tension for years. His ex-wife, Melissa, had moved into a rental in a neighboring county, and Connor spent alternating weeks between them. She told investigators David had been a devoted father, but admitted the separation had left him withdrawn. He'd missed a few scheduled custody exchanges in the spring, claiming last-minute work obligations, though she never suspected anything sinister. Then there were the finances. Bank statements revealed overdrawn accounts, a second mortgage taken out 3 years earlier, and several maxed-out credit cards. David had been behind on his property taxes for 2 years running. One of his coworkers recalled overhearing him argue with someone on the phone about an unpaid bill just a week before the fishing trip. Another remembered him mentioning that things were going to get sorted out soon, without elaborating. The most troubling lead came from a neighbor who told investigators about a dispute between David and a local property developer. According to the neighbor, the developer had been pressuring several residents to sell parcels of land near the lake for a new resort project. David's small lot wasn't directly in the target area, but it bordered a section of public boat access the developer reportedly wanted control over. The neighbor claimed David had refused to cooperate, leading to a heated exchange in the marina parking lot earlier that summer. Detectives tracked down the developer, who admitted to having words with David but denied any threats or ongoing conflict. He said he barely knew the man and certainly had no involvement in what happened. Still, investigators noted his name. In a case with so little to go on, every potential friction point mattered. As they pieced together these elements, a theme began to emerge. In the days before the trip, David had seemed distracted. A clerk at the marina bait shop remembered him coming in 2 days before the disappearance, buying more supplies than usual, but appearing a little out of it. A co-worker said David left work early twice that week, something he almost never did. Even Melissa, his ex-wife, said that when she spoke to him on the phone the night before the trip, his answers were short, his tone distant. These small details fueled speculation. Some began to wonder if David had staged his disappearance, taking Connor with him to start over somewhere far away. It was a theory that split opinion. Supporters pointed to the financial troubles and the personal upheaval in his life. Skeptics argued that if that had been his plan, he wouldn't have left the boat adrift with the motor running. He wouldn't have left his house unlocked and his bank accounts untouched. Another theory, darker and harder to dismiss, was that someone had used the trip as an opportunity for revenge. If David had crossed the wrong person over money, land, or some undisclosed grievance, a remote lake would be the perfect setting to settle a score. In that version of events, Connor may have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Detectives tried to map out David's last known movements before launch day. Surveillance footage from a gas station on the highway into town showed him filling his truck the night before, Connor sitting in the passenger seat. The footage revealed nothing unusual, but it confirmed they were together. Cell phone records were less helpful. David's phone had pinged off a tower near his home that night, then gone dark sometime the next morning. Connor's phone was powered off the entire trip, which Melissa said was unusual for him. The absence of a clear lead frustrated investigators. Every possible motive, debt, dispute, personal crisis, lacked the evidence to elevate it beyond speculation. Without witnesses or a crime scene, they were left with disconnected fragments of a life that didn't fully explain how it had ended up in the middle of a lake, abandoned. By the third week, the search of David's background had turned into a search for anyone who might have held a grudge, no matter how small. Old co-workers, acquaintances from fishing tournaments, former classmates, all were contacted. Most had nothing to offer beyond memories of a man they described as private but dependable. A few hinted at moments where David's temper had flared, but no one could link those moments to the day he vanished. The deeper they looked, the murkier the picture became. David Rowe was not the kind of man who left clean, predictable lines for others to follow. And without something tangible to connect his past to that day on the water, investigators were left with two unsettling possibilities. Either David had planned his disappearance down to the last detail, or someone else had planned it for him. Whichever it was, the truth seemed locked somewhere between the stillness of the lake and the shadows of his personal life, waiting for a break that never came. By the end of the second week, the official search for David and Connor had shifted from an active recovery mission to what investigators called targeted follow-up, a phrase that meant they were chasing whatever scraps of information still came in. Most days were quiet, the occasional call from a fisherman who thought he'd spotted something in the water, or a resident reporting an abandoned cooler or jacket along the shore. Almost all of it turned out to be unrelated. But then, a series of accounts surfaced that pulled the case in a new, unsettling direction. The first came from a man named William Carson, a retired truck driver who often fished the lake at night to avoid the daytime crowd. He told investigators he'd been anchored in the deeper western basin on the night David and Connor vanished. Sometime around 12:30 a.m., he saw a boat pass about 200 yards away. The hull and cabin matched the description of the Rose cruiser. What caught his attention wasn't just the late hour, but that there appeared to be three people aboard, one standing near the bow, another at the wheel, and a third figure seated toward the rear. Carson admitted the distance and the darkness made it impossible to be certain, but he was convinced enough to call it in once he learned about the missing boat. 2 days later, a second account emerged from Lisa Webb, who lived year-round in a small cabin along the North Shore. She told deputies she had been on her porch just after midnight that same night when she noticed a boat moving slowly along the opposite bank. At first, she assumed it was one of the local night fishermen, but something felt off. The running lights were off, unusual and dangerous on a lake that size. She could see the faint glow from inside the cabin, like a lantern or a flashlight, but no exterior illumination. She couldn't make out the number of people aboard, but the size and shape of the boat seemed to match what she'd seen in news photos of the Rose vessel. The third report came a week later from a younger man, Darren Holt, who worked maintenance at the lakeside resort. He claimed he'd been on the dock closing up for the night when he saw a boat gliding past, barely making a sound. He didn't notice the running lights either, but what stuck with him was the way the boat veered suddenly toward the mouth of a narrow inlet before disappearing from view. He didn't see anyone on deck, but he swore the engine tone changed abruptly, as though it had throttled down once it was hidden by the tree line. None of the accounts matched perfectly, the times varied by nearly an hour, and the distances and angles made identification far from certain. Investigators knew that in the darkness over water, size and shape could be deceptive. But what troubled them was that all three sightings placed a boat resembling the Rose in active use, well after the pair were expected to have reached their planned overnight stop. If David and Connor had intended to anchor near the islands to fish, they should have been settled long before midnight. When confronted with these witness reports, detectives revisited the drift path of the recovered cruiser. The boat had been found near the North Shore, idling in neutral. If it had been moving under its own power in the early morning hours, as the witnesses suggested, that meant someone, possibly not David or Connor, was at the helm after dark. The possibility of a third person on board changed the tenor of the investigation. Until now, most working theories revolved around an accident, a deliberate disappearance, or a confrontation between David and someone else before they ever left shore. But these sightings hinted that the critical events may have happened out on the water, hours after the Rose were last seen alive. Detectives began canvassing the marinas and fuel docks again, asking attendants if anyone had refueled a small cabin cruiser in the days following the disappearance. They checked security footage from private docks and lakefront businesses, but much of it had already been overwritten. None of the night sightings could be corroborated with hard evidence. Privately, some investigators believed the conflicting witness statements might never be reconciled. Memory in low-light conditions is notoriously unreliable, especially on open water where distances are hard to judge. But even with that knowledge, there was something they couldn't dismiss. 3 separate people, none of whom knew each other, had reported seeing a boat that matched the Rose at a time and place where it shouldn't have been. It forced the team to consider possibilities they hadn't before. If there was a third person, had they boarded willingly? Had David picked up someone he knew? Or had a stranger found their way onto the boat by force or deception? And if that third person had been the last to control the cruiser, what had they done with the father and son before leaving the vessel to drift? The reports were enough to keep the case from going cold entirely, but not enough to move it forward. Without physical evidence, they remained intriguing but unproven threads, tantalizing in their potential, frustrating in their lack of certainty. Still, the image lingered. A lone boat gliding through the darkness, its lights off, slipping toward some hidden destination, carrying with it the only people who could explain what really happened that night. The winter passed without a single new lead. By early spring, the Roe case had all but disappeared from the headlines. A few locals still spoke about it in the bait shops and diners around Lake Harrison, but for most, it had slipped into the background noise of unsolved tragedies, one more story filed away without resolution. That changed abruptly on a windy afternoon in late March, 6 months after David and Connor were last seen. A pair of hikers walking the narrow trails along the lake's northern bank noticed something unusual at the water's edge. The shoreline there was rocky and uneven, littered with driftwood from the recent thaw. Between 2 fallen logs, partly tangled in roots, they spotted what they first thought was a deer carcass. But as they got closer, it became clear they were looking at human remains, pale, weathered bones, the rib cage partially intact, and a skull lying at an angle as if it had rolled during the last swell. Sheriff's deputies responded within the hour, securing the area while waiting for the State Crime Lab's recovery team. The remains were fragile, some bones scattered and others embedded in the silt. The forensic anthropologist on scene estimated they had been in the water for months, maybe longer, but were too degraded to determine a cause of death at the site. No clothing, no shoes, no personal effects were found nearby, only the skeletal frame and a few strands of what appeared to be light brown hair lodged between the rocks. For the Roe family, the news was devastating, but also immediately complicated. Many assumed, at least at first, that the bones might belong to David. Connor, only 14 at the time of the disappearance, was far too young for the remains to be his. The possibility of recovering even part of David's body was a painful but potentially clarifying turn. But when the DNA results came back, they told a different story entirely. The remains were adult male, but not David Roe. The ruling baffled investigators. If the man wasn't David, then who was he? And more pressing, what was he doing in the same stretch of lake where the Roe's boat had been found? The discovery forced them to reopen lines of inquiry they'd already set aside. Could someone else entirely have been on that boat the night they vanished? If so, was this man connected to their disappearance, or just another unsolved tragedy the lake had claimed? Theories spiraled quickly. Some investigators wondered if the remains could belong to a missing person from outside the area, maybe someone brought to the lake to dispose of the body. Others floated the possibility that the man had been aboard the Roe's boat and met the same fate they had, his body surfacing first, due to differences in weight or location of submersion. Quietly, detectives reached out to neighboring states, asking for DNA comparisons against their lists of long-term missing persons. They didn't make the request public, not wanting to spark false hope or encourage the flood of unfounded tips that had plagued the early weeks of the case. The testing process dragged on for months, each request moving through multiple jurisdictions, each sample taking weeks to analyze. In the meantime, the find rekindled public interest in the Roe disappearance. Local papers ran stories with side-by-side photos of the lake and archival shots of the cruiser being towed in. Talk radio hosts speculated about whether the remains meant foul play was now undeniable. Amateur sleuths online began mapping the lake, plotting where the bones were found against where the boat had drifted, pointing out how currents could carry objects, or bodies, to that northern bank over time. But without a name, the body was as much a question mark as it was an answer. The sheriff's office gave a single brief press conference confirming the remains were not David Roe and stating only that testing against other missing persons was ongoing. Reporters pressed for more, but the department held its ground. Whatever they were learning, they weren't sharing it. By early summer, the official investigation was once again quiet. No public match for the remains was ever announced. It was unclear whether the DNA failed to match anyone in the databases or whether the results were being withheld for strategic reasons. Inside the department, the find was both a gift and a burden, a possible new lead, but one that expanded the scope of the case into territory they hadn't been prepared for. For those following the story, the meaning of the discovery depended on how they already saw the case. To some, it proved there had been a third person on that boat, someone whose involvement had ended violently. To others, it was just coincidence. Lake Harrison was deep, unpredictable, and its history of drownings and boating accidents stretched back decades. The remains could be from any number of tragedies unrelated to the Roes. But for the investigators still assigned to the file, the sight of those bones on the northern bank was impossible to shake. It was a reminder that something, or someone, had shared the lake with David and Connor that night, and until they knew who that man was, they couldn't know whether he was the key to explaining the Roe's disappearance, or simply another unsolved story the water had chosen to give back. By the 5th anniversary of the disappearance, the Roe case had settled into the kind of uneasy limbo that swallows most missing persons investigations. The file was still there in the sheriff's office, thick with reports, photographs, and dead-end leads, but there hadn't been a new page added in over a year. For the investigators who had worked it from the beginning, the absence of progress was a quiet defeat, not a moment where the case was officially closed, but a slow erosion of momentum until it existed mostly in memory. Life in the community had moved on, even if the details of that September day still lingered in the back of people's minds. Connor's classmates, who had been 14 when he vanished, were now young adults. They'd gone to prom, gotten their driver's licenses, applied to colleges, all milestones that, for Connor, would remain frozen in photographs from before the trip. At the high school graduation ceremony in 2017, his name was read aloud among the class list, followed by a pause that felt heavier than the rest. A chair had been left empty in the front row, a gesture of remembrance that brought more than one person to tears. Melissa Roe, David's ex-wife and Connor's mother, eventually left the state. The weight of staying in the same town where every grocery store aisle and every gas station line came with sidelong glances, and the quiet question, "Have they found anything yet?" became too much. She sold her house in the spring of 2018 and moved to live near her sister in Colorado. Before leaving, she gave one final interview to the local paper, her voice steady but her eyes red. She said she still believed her son was out there somewhere, even if she had stopped believing in answers. Each September, the anniversary brought the case briefly back into public view. Local reporters would run a segment revisiting the disappearance, often using the same archival footage of the cruiser being hauled into shore, the same grainy photographs of David and Connor smiling beside a string of freshly caught bass. Detectives assigned to the cold case unit would answer a few questions for the camera, reiterating that the investigation remained open, that all tips were followed up. But behind the careful language, There was no disguising the truth. No new evidence had surfaced. From time to time, tips would still trickle in, usually after one of those anniversary broadcasts. A trucker in Montana swore he'd seen a man and a teenage boy matching their descriptions hitchhiking along an interstate. A family in Arkansas reported a father and son at a roadside diner who looked just like the Rose. In each case, photographs or security footage were obtained and reviewed, and in each case, the lead evaporated within days. The supposed sightings were always someone else, a father and son from another town, a pair of travelers who happened to fit the vague outline of the missing. Over time, even the false sightings became rarer. The Rose story was still known, but it had shifted into something quieter, more spectral. The lake itself seemed to absorb it, becoming part of the case's identity. Newcomers to the area would hear about the father and son who went out fishing and never came back, from neighbors or at bait shops, told as if it were half local legend, half warning. Longtime residents avoided speaking about it unless asked directly, as though keeping the details tucked away might prevent the sadness from settling too heavily on the present. There were still those who obsessed over the case, a handful of amateur sleuths online who kept discussion threads alive, rehashing the witness statements about a third person on the boat, cross-referencing weather data from that night, speculating endlessly about the unidentified remains found months later. But in the physical world of Lake Harrison, the Roe case was becoming something else entirely, a ghost story with no ending, woven into the fabric of the community not by answers, but by the enduring lack of them. For the sheriff's office, keeping it open was more about principle than expectation. Every so often, a new detective would be assigned to review the file, hoping a fresh set of eyes might spot something overlooked. They never did. The evidence remained what it had always been: a boat adrift, a handful of personal items, a few inconsistent witness reports, and a set of remains that belonged to someone else. By the fall of 2018, 5 years after that calm September morning, the Rose disappearance had joined the ranks of those cases that lived on not because they were solved, but because they never were. It had no neat resolution, no confession, no recovered bodies. Just a father and son who left shore together and never returned, leaving behind a space in the lives of those who loved them, and a lake that, for all its beauty, would forever carry the weight of what it might still be hiding. It was just after dawn on a cold morning in late October 2025 when the dockhand at Lake Harrison Marina noticed a figure moving unsteadily along the boardwalk. At first glance, it looked like a transient, thin, hunched, clothes hanging in tatters. The man was barefoot, his skin ashen, his hair matted and unkempt. He moved as if every step was an effort, one hand trailing along the rail for balance. The dockhand called out, but the man didn't respond. He just kept coming, slow but steady, until he reached the slip at the far end, the very slip where David and Connor Rowe had tied off their boat 12 years earlier. When the dockhand approached, the man stopped, swaying slightly. Up close, it was clear he was dehydrated, lips cracked, cheeks hollowed by malnutrition. His clothes were mismatched, an oversized flannel shirt buttoned wrong over a pair of pants, cinched at the waist with what looked like fishing line. The dockhand tried again to get his attention, asking if he was hurt, if he needed help. No answer. The man's head tilted slightly toward the sound, and that's when the dockhand saw it, the faint pale scarring where his eyes should have been. Both sockets were empty, the lids fused shut, the skin healed long ago. Within minutes, deputies and paramedics arrived. The man didn't resist when they led him to the waiting ambulance. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't seem to register the crowd that had begun to gather at the edge of the parking lot. At the hospital, they ran his fingerprints through the state database. The match came back in seconds. Connor James Rowe, missing since September 14, 2013. The news broke before noon. By evening, reporters had set up outside the hospital entrance, waiting for any official statement. The sheriff's office confirmed his identity and said only that Connor was in stable condition, but unable or unwilling to provide information about where he had been. They asked for privacy for the family, though, in this case, family was a complicated term. Melissa Rowe, now living in Colorado, was flown in the next day. She hadn't seen her son since he was 14, and now she was walking into a hospital room to face a man in his mid-20s who bore almost no resemblance to the boy she remembered. Doctors determined that Connor's eyes had been surgically removed years earlier. The tissue around the sockets was clean and well healed, with no signs of recent injury or infection. Whoever had done it had done so under sterile conditions, and with enough medical knowledge to avoid complications. The exact timing was impossible to pin down, but the best estimate placed the procedure within a year of his disappearance. Aside from the obvious, Connor's body told its own story. He was severely underweight, with the kind of muscle atrophy that suggested long-term confinement. He had old, partially healed fractures in both forearms and one rib, along with deep scar tissue across his back and shoulders. Toxicology screens revealed no current drugs in his system, but trace markers suggested he'd been on some form of sedative for an extended period in the past. Investigators were careful at first, hoping that time and safety might coax him into talking. But in the initial days, Connor said almost nothing. The most he offered were short, fragmented phrases: lower deck, light under the water, don't let him back on shore. None of it came with context. Detectives tried different approaches: structured interviews, casual conversation, even silence. His answers never expanded. Sometimes he would sit for hours without moving, his hands folded in his lap, as if waiting for something only he could sense. For law enforcement, his reappearance was both a breakthrough and a nightmare. It confirmed that at least one of the Rows had survived, but it also brought 1,000 new questions. Where had he been for 12 years? Who had taken him? Why bring him back now? And why like this? The absence of his eyes added a layer of deliberate cruelty that suggested his captivity had been as much about control as concealment. Melissa visited him daily, though those visits were painfully one-sided. She would talk to him about his childhood, about their old dog, about the things she hoped to do together if he got well enough to leave the hospital. Sometimes he would turn his head toward her voice, but he never spoke her name. The doctors cautioned her that trauma like his could take years to unravel, if it unraveled at all. As news crews swarmed the marina, locals began recalling old details in a new light. The witness statements about a third person on the boat, the unidentified remains found months later, the conflicting theories that had gone nowhere. All of it felt newly connected, even if no one could prove how. The sheriff's office promised a full review of the case from the ground up, now with Connor's survival as the centerpiece. But behind closed doors, the investigative team faced a sobering truth. They had a living witness who might hold the key to everything, and he either couldn't or wouldn't give it to them. And in the quiet moments between interviews, when Connor sat in the corner of his hospital room, unmoving, the deputies on guard sometimes swore they could hear him whispering to himself. They could never make out the words. But one thing was certain. Whatever had happened to him out there on the water had not stayed behind when he walked back onto that dock. It had come back with him, and it was still very much alive. The hospital's initial assessments painted a grim and baffling picture of what Connor Rowe had endured. He weighed barely 120 pounds, his frame gaunt and fragile, a sharp contrast to the athletic teenager who had vanished in 2013. His skin bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged malnutrition. Dry, sallow, with deep lines that didn't match his age. Old fractures showed clearly on x-rays, both forearms broken at different times, 3 ribs on his left side healed crooked, and a collarbone that had once been shattered. Across his back and shoulders ran a lattice of scar tissue, some from shallow cuts, others from what specialists recognized as possible ligature marks, the kind left when someone is bound repeatedly over long stretches of time. The most unsettling discovery came from the ophthalmology team. Their examination confirmed that both eyes had been surgically removed, the lids fused shut over sunken sockets. The tissue was fully healed, with no infection or recent trauma, indicating the procedure had been performed under sterile conditions at least a decade earlier. That meant Connor had likely lost his sight within the first year of his disappearance, before he had even turned 15. Whoever had done it had known enough about anatomy and wound care to prevent life-threatening complications, but the precision suggested intent far beyond necessity. In those first days, Connor was silent. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, and didn't react to the constant presence of law enforcement, medical staff, or his mother. He seemed to navigate the hospital room purely by the sound of voices and the feel of surfaces under his fingertips, moving only when guided. Attempts to question him met with blank stillness, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something far away. Psychologists noted that his demeanor lacked the panic of someone newly freed. Instead, it carried the quiet resignation of someone who had been living under rules no one else could see. It wasn't until the fourth day that Connor spoke, and even then, the words came without warning or clear connection to what was happening in the room. A nurse adjusting his IV heard him say, almost under his breath, "The lower deck." When asked what he meant, he said nothing more. Over the next week, other phrases emerged in the same way: "the light under the water," and "don't let him back on shore." They came without context, like fragments of a larger story he was either unwilling or unable to share. Investigators recorded every word, hoping the pieces might eventually form a map to where he'd been and what had happened to him. The lower deck suggested a boat, or at least a structure with multiple levels. The light under the water puzzled them. Some speculated it could refer to the glow of submerged lighting, common on larger vessels, while others wondered if it was more metaphorical, the last thing he saw before losing his sight. But it was, "Don't let him back on shore," that unsettled everyone. The way Connor said it, flat and final, made it sound less like a plea and more like a warning. Despite multiple approaches, formal interrogations, casual conversations, sessions with trauma specialists, Connor never elaborated. Sometimes he would seem to retreat inward when questioned, his face turning away, his posture stiffening. Other times he would sit motionless, lips slightly parted, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. The investigation shifted to focus on the possibility of long-term captivity aboard a vessel. Marine units were consulted, and retired Coast Guard officers were brought in to discuss whether someone could keep a person hidden for years on a boat without detection. The theory had logistical problems: resupply, fuel, maintenance, but Lake Harrison was connected by river channels to other bodies of water. If his captor had moved him early on, he could have been taken far from the lake before anyone knew to look. David Rowe's fate remained a gaping hole in the narrative. Connor never spoke his father's name, never asked where he was, never reacted when investigators mentioned him. This silence only deepened the uncertainty. Had David died the day they vanished? Had he been taken too? Or had something happened between father and son in those first hours that Connor could not or would not speak of? Melissa spent long hours at his bedside, often reading aloud from old family photo albums or describing places they had once gone together. Sometimes Connor would turn his head toward her voice, his expression unreadable, and other times he seemed to drift into stillness, as if those memories belonged to another life entirely. Behind the hospital's closed doors, the case file thickened again. Detectives cross-referenced his statements with every prior lead, revisiting old witness accounts of a third person on the boat and the unidentified remains found on the northern bank months after the disappearance. They consulted with forensic psychologists who cautioned that trauma and sensory deprivation could warp memory, mixing reality with impressions and symbols. Parsing truth from confusion could take years, if it happened at all. Outside, the community reacted with a mix of shock and unease. Connor's return should have been a cause for celebration, but the manner of it, the condition he was in, the silence, the missing years, gave it the feel of a ghost returning from a place no one could name. And with each passing day, one fact became harder to ignore. The only living person who knew what had happened on Lake Harrison in 2013 might never be able to tell it. The push to understand Connor's scattered statements led investigators back to the one piece of physical evidence they still had: the Rose boat. It had been sitting in a climate-controlled police storage facility for over a decade, preserved in the exact condition it was found, drifting near the North Shore. In 2013, forensic teams had gone over it with the tools of the time: luminol sprays, fingerprint dusting, fiber collection. Nothing conclusive had been recovered beyond a few partial prints that belonged to David and Connor. Now, armed with modern forensic imaging and chemical detection techniques far beyond what they had had 12 years earlier, the cold case unit decided to re-examine the cruiser from bow to stern. They started with the bilge area, a cramped, low space beneath the deck where water and oil often collect. It was an unlikely place to hide evidence, but also one that might have been overlooked in the original search. Using high-sensitivity spectrography, they picked up faint discolorations invisible to the naked eye. When swabbed and tested, the samples revealed dried blood. The amount wasn't large, not enough to suggest a massive injury, but the DNA profile came back quickly and with absolute certainty. It was David Rose. The result raised more questions than it answered. If David had been injured badly enough to bleed into the bilge, why wasn't there more blood elsewhere on the boat? Had he been alive when it happened? And if not, how had his body vanished without a trace? Connor's earlier phrases, "lower deck," "light under the water," now seemed less like cryptic ramblings and more like fragments of a memory connected to this very space. The lower deck could have been the bilge area. The light under the water might have been the glow from a dock or a submerged lamp during a nighttime transfer. Whatever the meaning, investigators began treating these references as navigational clues rather than disconnected words. The search turned toward the lake's outer edges, where abandoned boatyards and repair facilities had once serviced fishing fleets before the industry shrank. Many were little more than collapsing sheds and rusted docks now, but they offered secluded spaces where someone could offload cargo or a person unseen. Working from old property maps, detectives identified 6 such sites within a 30-mile radius of Lake Harrison. They started with the ones accessible only by water, combing through rotting slipways and sheds choked with weeds. At the third location, a long-defunct yard tucked in a cove shielded by steep tree-covered bluffs, a deputy poking through a collapsed workshed noticed a heavy object half buried under debris. It was an anchor chain, thick links fused with rust, wrapped tightly in a length of canvas so stained and brittle it tore at the lightest touch. When the chain was rolled free, several small fabric remnants fell out, scraps of clothing that had once been blue and white. One piece still had a plastic shirt button clinging to it. The evidence was rushed to the lab. The cloth was degraded from exposure to moisture and time, but fiber analysis identified it as cotton poly blend, consistent with casual button-down shirts sold in the early 2010s. The surviving scraps matched the color and weave of the shirt David had been wearing in photographs from the morning of the trip, a white base with thin blue stripes. The anchor chain itself was more difficult to date, but its size and weight were enough to hold a small boat in place against moderate current. That raised a chilling possibility. The chain and canvas could have been used to weigh something down in the water. If so, had someone retrieved it later? And if they had, why? The location of the find fit too neatly with Connor's "don't let him back on shore" warning for investigators to dismiss. The cove was secluded, accessible only from the lake or a single overgrown road, and had long been outside the range of active patrols. A person could have done almost anything there without fear of being seen. For the first time in years, detectives felt they were following a physical trail rather than speculation. But it was a trail with no clear end. Divers were brought in to search the silt-heavy water near the boatyard's submerged dock pilings. They found nothing. No human remains, no additional clothing, no personal effects. The lake bed here was uneven, riddled with crevices deep enough to hide anything forever. Still, the discovery was enough to reframe the investigation. It tied David physically to a location, away from the boat's original drift path, and hinted strongly at foul play. But it also deepened the central mystery. If David had been injured, maybe even killed, during the trip, had Connor witnessed it? Had he been spared or kept alive for reasons the captor never revealed? Back in the evidence room, the anchor chain and stained canvas were sealed in separate containers, labeled with the date and GPS coordinates of recovery. Photographs were logged, samples taken, and reports filed. But even as they documented the find, every investigator knew the same thing. Objects like these didn't wash up by accident. Someone had put them there. And if that someone was still alive, they had carried a secret through 12 years of silence, one that had just started to come apart at the edges. Connor's return had been the most startling development the Roe case had seen in over a decade, and the sheriff's office treated him as both a witness and a potential target. After his release from the hospital, he was moved quietly to a secure care facility in a neighboring county, a low-profile center with locked wards, medical staff on site, and controlled visitor access. The arrangement was meant to shield him from media attention while allowing investigators time to build trust and hopefully coax more of his story from him. For a few weeks, the plan seemed to hold. Connor kept largely to himself, speaking in the same fragmented phrases he'd offered before, but he was physically recovering. His weight was improving, his posture a little steadier. Staff noted that he would sometimes stand near the window for hours, facing a particular direction, toward the northwest, where, over the distant hills, the waters of Lake Harrison lay unseen but not forgotten. Then, without warning, he was gone. On the morning of December 2nd, 2025, a nurse making her first rounds found his room empty. The door was locked from the inside, but the window, narrow, reinforced and designed not to open fully, was ajar. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence that anyone else had been inside. Security footage showed nothing unusual except a brief gap in the cameras covering the east wing, a 10-minute blackout blamed on a power surge. Search teams combed the surrounding area for days. K-9 units followed a faint scent trail down a wooded slope behind the facility, but lost it near a county road. No vehicles were seen in the area, no witnesses came forward. It was as if Connor had stepped out of the building and vanished into thin air. The investigation into his disappearance quickly hit the same wall the original case had. Without leads, every theory was guesswork. Some believed he'd been taken again, perhaps by the same person who had held him for 12 years. Others argued that he had left on his own, driven by a need to return to something unfinished. There were even suggestions that his escape had been facilitated from the inside, though no evidence ever supported that. By early 2026, the sheriff's office issued a formal update to the case file. David Roe was officially listed as presumed deceased, based on the blood evidence recovered from the boat and the clothing remnants found at the abandoned boatyard. Connor's status was marked in colder language, located, whereabouts currently unknown. On paper, that meant the missing persons case was resolved. In reality, it was anything but. The public reaction was conflicted. For years, the Roe case had been a wound in the community's memory, an unanswered question tied to the lake. Connor's brief reappearance had seemed, at first, like a miracle, the start of answers, maybe even closure. But his sudden disappearance left people feeling unmoored, as if the mystery had only deepened. In town, the story shifted into something between rumor and folklore. Locals began to talk about sightings, never confirmed, of a lone man standing on the marina docks late at night, always in shadow, always silent, facing the water. Some swore they saw him tilt his head as if listening to something carried on the waves. A few claimed that when they called out to him, he turned just enough for them to see the pale, healed scars where his eyes should have been, before stepping back and vanishing into the darkness. Law enforcement never endorsed these accounts, but they didn't dismiss them outright either. The marina was public space. Anyone could be there. Still, deputies quietly began adding late-night patrols to the area, if only to discourage the curious from trying to chase the ghost of the Roe case themselves. For the families involved, the reappearance and second disappearance of Connor Roe was a cruel doubling of grief. Melissa, his mother, returned to Colorado after weeks of waiting for news, her hope whittled down to something she could no longer articulate. "I thought I'd already lost him once," she told a reporter in a rare moment of candor, "but now I don't even know which loss is real." The sheriff's office kept the file open, technically. It was policy. Cases involving suspicious circumstances and missing persons are rarely closed entirely without a body. But with no new evidence, the active work slowed to almost nothing. What remained were the fragments: a boat found adrift, a father who never came home, a son who returned altered beyond recognition, and the lingering sense that the water still held more than it had given back. Officially, the case of David and Connor Rowe is unsolved. Unofficially, it's something else, a story that refuses to end, one that leaves even the most seasoned investigators with the uneasy feeling that part of it is still playing out, somewhere just out of sight. And for those who pass the marina on quiet nights, the thought is impossible to shake. If the man in the shadows is Connor, then maybe he never really left the lake at all.